Hyde Park. We are Boston's new home for classic R&B and hip in Heat 98.1 FM and 1410 AM.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this show are those of the host, guests, and callers and are not necessarily those of WZBR, its management, affiliates, and advertisers. WZBR and the Urban Heat holds no responsibility for the validity and/or accuracy of information on this show.
Hi, I'm drkerryann, and I understand the importance of Black mental health. That's why I decided to start my own show on the Urban Heat, Black Mental Health Matters. Join me on Sundays at 1 p.m., where we will discuss interesting topics and meet experts in Black mental health. Let's talk about the mental health issues facing our community. Listen online at heat981fm.com or download the app 98.1 FM, the Urban Heat. See you then.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Carrie-Ann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts, and this is a talk show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community. So if you'd like to participate throughout the show, you can give us a call at 617-238-7111. That's 617-238-7111. You can also follow us live on Facebook. This radio show will be streaming on the Facebook page, heat981fm.com. So today I'm asking the question, do you have racial anxiety? Do you have racial anxiety? What is racial anxiety? Well, according to the Perception Institute, racial anxiety is the high stress and high emotion that we deal with when interacting with people of other races, okay? The high stress and high emotion that we deal with when we're interacting with people of other races. So the person that's part of the minority group will be worried that they're going to be discriminated against. And the person that belongs to the dominant group, which in the US are white Americans, they are worried that they will be assumed to be racist. So then the interactions across these races can cause anxiety. And I remember in a previous show, I said that anxiety has three parts to it. So there's the thoughts, there's the feelings, and the behaviors. So this racial anxiety then will manifest in our thoughts, our perceptions, but also our feelings about the interaction, and then our behaviors during the interaction, after the interaction. So if we anticipate that it's going to be a negative interaction, it can actually change our body language. So then rather than making friendly eye contact, using a pleasant tone of voice, we can end up being defensive. And so our body language can come across as being more negative, creating kind of like this negative interaction. And so then the very thing that you anticipate can end up happening. And anxiety, particularly racial anxiety, then can make what would otherwise have been a neutral interaction a lot more emotional, a lot more emotionally charged. So then what about if your interactions are not just with everyday people that you come across? What if it's with people that are integral to your success? You know, what if the person that is anxious, racially anxious in the interaction with you is your teacher who determines your final grade? What if it's your supervisor who has to give you a recommendation or evaluation? What if it's your doctor who has to give you the appropriate dose of pain medication, right? When racial anxiety is present, it can influence assessments with people who are in charge, and it can compromise proper health care with people who are supposed to be helping you and healing you. So if you're the person that's in the dominant group, and you're anxious that you're going to be perceived as racist, then if you're a teacher, you may withhold constructive criticism of a student's work. There's actually a study that showed that there were some white advisors that failed to warn Black students that they were taking on too much for their course load, while they appropriately warned white and Asian students that they were taking on too much. And so there's the assumption that perhaps they're worried that they're going to be perceived as trying to limit the Black person's, potential. So then they didn't warn them. So racial anxiety can causes kind of almost like an overcompensation, like an overcorrection out of a fear of being perceived as being racist. In addition, the fear of being considered racist, that racial anxiety in the interaction, can lead a person to believe that the other is threatening. Okay. So they're worried that the interaction is going to go badly, and they feel insecure, they feel at risk in the interaction. And I remember in a previous show, I explained that anxiety is basically your body's alarm system. So just like a house alarm, if your house alarm went off, you immediately wonder, what's wrong? What's going on? Let me find out what the source of this is, right? Why am I feeling so anxious? And there's a similar process that happens if you're having an interaction where there's racial anxiety. Your body's alarm system is the same. It's going to say, what's wrong? Why am I feeling so anxious? And you might kind of use words like instinct or feeling, but really it's that you're feeling anxious in an interracial interaction. And you ask the question, what's wrong? Why is it that my threat detection system is activated? So when people experience anxiety and your threat detection system is activated, you're going to start to pay closer attention for cues of threatening behavior, right? So this is where you're going to hear people say things like, well, I thought I saw him move a certain way. He kind of moved his hand a certain way and I wasn't sure what he was going to do. Or they'll say things like, well, it kind of seemed like he had a weapon. And of course, a person might have been completely unarmed. And it's because when you have racial anxiety, when you have anxiety in interaction, you start to look for, you kind of become a bit vigilant for cues of threats. And it can be really dangerous if one person in the interaction has a weapon and the other doesn't, because you could just flinch and you might get shot because that other person is really vigilant for signs of danger and threat. And they might tend to see neutral things as a potential threat. So this falls under racial anxiety as well. And, in the healthcare system, racial anxiety can lead to healthcare providers having more like awkward interactions with patients of color. So imagine, again, if you're on the side of the fence where you're worried about being perceived as being racist, you may end up not being aware that you're doing this, but studies show that you may have shorter appointments, less informative appointments, and actually involve that patient of color less in decision making. So you end up becoming a bit more paternalistic. You kind of just start making recommendations rather than having a discussion about your thoughts. Because the longer you stay in that interaction, the more awkward you feel, and the more anxious you feel. So racial anxiety is also fueled by unconscious bias, okay? That anxiety is fueled by unconscious bias. So of course we have a part of our mind that's fully conscious, we're aware of, we have some control of, but there's a part of our mind that is automatic. We don't have as much control over it. It's that part of our mind that is kind of unconscious. That part is strongly influenced by messages that we've received throughout life. Okay. And there's different kinds of messages. There's the kind of the overt messages that people kind of literally tell you negative things and negative stereotypes. But there's also the implicit messages, just observations you make about the world that you use to form like a template about what the world is supposed to be like. So here are some examples of some of the messages that form and influence our automatic thoughts and help to form this template about how we see other races. There is sometimes overt messages, right? So a parent that literally tells you, watch out for those kinds of people, they're this and they're that. Those are overt messages that can also be encoded and become part of your automatic response, especially if you heard those messages in childhood, okay? But there's also the implicit messages. So maybe they didn't tell you to watch out for racial groups, but you observed from childhood, your mother clutching her bag more tightly if a black man is approaching, or crossing the street, or, these sorts of nonverbal behaviors. You take that in and you kind of learn this message that there's something here. There's something to be worried about, and it's something unspeakable. The other thing, of course, we've spoken about this before, is images on TV and in the media, right? If you always see particular racial groups typecast in certain kinds of roles over and over and over and over, they're always a sidekick, they're always the entertaining friend, they're always the sports figure, then eventually your brain begins to have this pattern. It forms a template that this is kind of where people fit in society. The longer it goes on, the more comfortable you get with people playing those roles, right? So if then later on someone tries to break the mold and cast someone in a role that you're not used to seeing that racial group in, it begins to feel uncomfortable. It doesn't feel right. And again, it's not because you're being racist, it just doesn't feel right. And part of it is, again, because you're just so used to seeing racial groups typecast in certain kinds of roles that you've gained a comfort with seeing in people in those places. The other thing that can influence our kind of that unconscious bias, that automatic response that we have, is life experience. Particularly if you don't have a lot of experience with people of different races, if you only have a handful of experiences with people of other races, then your entire template is formed on just a few interactions. So if, for example, when you were a kid, you had a bike and your bike was stolen by somebody who's Hispanic, then all of a sudden you kind of encode that into your unconscious bias that you remember when you were 7, your bike was stolen by a Hispanic boy. And now as an adult, you don't know why you feel mistrustful of Hispanic people. And some of it is because you had this experience when you were younger. And so, of course, the antidote to that is to increase the number of experiences that you have with people from other backgrounds. Because if you only have the one experience, that's all you have. But if you have 200 other experiences to negate that one bad experience, then your brain can put it into context and say, hey, listen, this entire race of people are not bad. It was just one bad thing that happened to me when I was younger. So there are a lot of things that influence our unconscious bias, it includes your personal experiences as well as messages that have been given to you both overtly and implicitly, both in words and non-verbally. And that can fuel racial anxiety. So now you get into these interactions with people and you're not sure why you feel anxious or threatened by them. But it's all built up based on these things, these messages. Right. So one of the ways that it can play out is you're a supervisor and you're interviewing someone for a job and they may look great on paper, but after the interview you think, oh, they just don't feel right for this job. And you think, oh, well, it's not because they're black, it's not because they're black, I just don't know, I don't feel like they have the qualifications, or that sort of thing. And you may not realize that because you've taken in messages about the competence of Black people being less, that now you don't realize that maybe you're trying to find more proof that that person is truly capable of leadership, or because you're taking in messages doubting the trustworthiness of certain people groups, that you may feel uncomfortable hiring them because you've taken in messages about them being untrustworthy. And so it kind of leads into this issue of, in the Black community, we talk about having to be twice as good, and it's not a myth. It's true. And I think about when I first moved to the U.S. as an adolescent, really, and no one had to tell me that I needed to be twice as good. I just knew that intuitively. The moment I set foot here, I knew that there was a burden of proof that I had to prove that I was capable, more so than other people that were here. And maybe I felt that burden of proof as an immigrant, but I think also just as a Black person in America, I knew that I had to prove my competence in a very strong way. So I prioritized that. I think about this idea, that is the kind of thing that fuels racial anxiety. I guess you could say I had some racial anxiety in interactions, kind of wondering, am I going to be discriminated against because I'm Black? Am I going to be thought of as less capable and less competent just because of the color of my skin? So it's interesting that what can happen with unconscious bias is that we may not realize that the standard that we're holding people to is almost kind of like the standard of the dominant group, which again, here it would be a standard of whiteness. It's a very strong pull, right? So then you have a candidate that they look equal on paper, and one is black and one is white. There's a magnetic pull to choose the white candidate over the black candidate because of unconscious bias and racial anxiety. So when we have that anxiety, when we go for jobs, we feel like we can't just match the other person's credentials. We need to beat them. But there's also this anxiety that if you kind of go too far, then people might say, well, you're overqualified, for the position, and kind of use that as a reason to say, well, I'm not racist. You're overqualified for the position. So there's a lot of things that we have to deal with really when it comes to anxiety based on race in interactions and job hiring and things like that. I wanted to share a study done by the Perception Institute. They cited a research study, and it says a research team sent a memo to partners at law firms asking for feedback on quality, right? So they sent a memo to partners at law firms asking for feedback on quality. The memo was identical, and it was said to be written by a third-year associate. And I don't know much about law, but it's a third-year associate named Thomas Meyer, who studied at NYU Law School. Okay, it's a fictional character. Okay, but they sent this memo, and half of the partners that the memo was sent to were told that Thomas Meyer is a black man. And then the other half of the partners were told that Thomas Meyer is a white man. Okay, they all got the same memo, same credentials. The only difference is half the partners told that this guy is white, and half told that this guy is black. Okay. And the partners' feedback to the memo showed stark differences based on race. So when the partners thought that Thomas Meyer was a white man, the feedback they gave to the memo said, generally good writer, and that the memo has potential. When the partners thought that Thomas Meyer was a black man, they described that their feedback was average at best, and the memo needs a lot of work. Okay, so it went from the memo has potential to the memo needs a lot of work. The only difference was not the memo, just the race of the author. The other finding is that in this research team, they deliberately included about 7 spelling and grammar errors. Deliberately put in about 7 spelling and grammar errors. And when the partners thought that Thomas Meyer was a white man, they only found about 2.9 out of the 7 errors on average of the partners that received the memo, 2.9 out of the 7 errors. But when they thought that Thomas Meyer was a black man, they found 5.8 out of the 7 errors. Okay, so they're searching for and finding more errors when they think the author is someone black versus white. Okay, so the authors of the study suggested this outcome reflects what they call confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, which is that the brain will observe and absorb information that affirms your established belief, right? So if you already believe that black people are less competent, you're more likely to find and take in information that affirms that belief. Also, confirmation bias includes disregarding data that contradicts what you already believe. So there may have been parts of the memo that were good, but you may kind of just disregard that because it conflicts with your pre-existing kind of unconscious bias about black people. So not only do the partners interpret the same content entirely differently depending on the race of the author, but in doing so, they reinforce their existing racial stereotypes. So if you guys are just joining, you're listening to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Drkerryann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist here in Massachusetts. And today I'm talking about racial anxiety. What is it and what can we do about it? If you want to give us a call, the phone number here is 617-238-7111. That's 617-238-7111. We're also streaming live on Facebook on the page heat981fm.com on Facebook. So you can go to the live feed and drop a comment there. Thanks for those that have already joined. So, racial anxiety and unconscious bias. Racial anxiety is fueled by unconscious bias. Unconscious bias can even affect our body language, right? So again, not something that we might be fully aware that we're doing. Sometimes we have some awareness, but sometimes not. Sometimes someone else has to bring it to our awareness. But it can affect things like how far we stand from people, or even standing over them. Like there's a classic picture from 2016 from the presidential debates where you see Trump kind of hovering over Hillary Clinton, kind of in a menacing kind of way, like standing very close to her and kind of hovering over her. That's a kind of a classic example of how your kind of your template of how you see the world can change your body language and how you interact with people. But even you know, thinking about in physicians, in the world of physicians, I had a couple of physicians on last year, 2 women who spoke about sexism, and there is body language that sometimes between male physicians and female physicians, and they may not realize things that they may do, kind of like patting people on the shoulder or the back, which kind of communicates this like good job kid. You know, it's kind of a diminishing kind of body language. And that communicates dominance. And that kind of thing can happen in racial interactions as well. And there's so many examples in higher education of Black graduate students, professors, physicians who experience this kind of show of dominance in body language and other kinds of messages that are given just non-verbally with people that they work with, you know, just to communicate, to kind of keep people in their place almost. So I'd be curious to know if this has played out in your experience, or whether or not you have experienced this, or whether you've seen this. So have you guys ever heard about the idea of the stereotype threat? The stereotype threat. So the stereotype threat is when a negative stereotype about your own race gets activated inside of you and causes you to underperform and basically live up to the negative stereotype. So for example, you could have a classroom, maybe the subject is science, engineering, math, some kind of STEM field, and it's pretty much all boys, but there's one girl in the class. That one girl is at risk of underperforming if, you know, by the kind of that rule of the stereotype threat, if that person believes the stereotype that boys are better than girls in STEM fields, they are at risk of underperforming because of stereotype threat. And there's a thought that the stereotype threat has actually been linked to underperformance of Black and Latino students in school as well. This feeling of like, if you believe the stereotype that you're inferior in some way, you are actually at risk of performing below your abilities. And so stereotype threat involves internalized bias, because we have these unconscious assumptions about our own abilities and potential in the world. So it's a self-limiting bias, okay? Now, some kinds of racial anxiety are fueled by racial trauma, okay? So sometimes the reason that we have this anxiety in cross-racial discussions is because of trauma, racial trauma. And according to Mental Health America, racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress is the mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. Okay, any individual that has experienced an emotionally painful, sudden, and uncontrollable racist encounter is at risk of suffering from a race-based traumatic stress injury. And in the US, there's this group called BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. They're considered the most vulnerable to this kind of race-based traumatic stress. And prolonged experiences with racism can lead to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, prolonged incidents of experiencing racism can cause depression, anger, problems with anger, unwanted memories of racist experiences, so like flashbacks of racist experiences, physical issues like headaches, chest pain, difficulty sleeping. Okay, racism can lead people to become hyper vigilant, hyper aware of their surroundings, hyper aware of threats. Racism can cause people to devalue themselves. And that, of course, it can be depressing. And these are post-traumatic symptoms and signs of racial trauma. It can also be traumatic to witness other people experiencing racism. So, for example, that could be, you know, watching videos of police brutality. Okay, it's called vicarious trauma because you're not the one experiencing it, but you're witnessing it, and you can almost imagine yourself being in that position, being the one in that situation. Or if not yourself, you can imagine someone that you know, a brother, an uncle, in that situation. Okay, especially if the person in the video kind of resembles somebody that you know, right? Which happens from time to time. That vicarious trauma can cause racial anxiety when you go to interact with other people. So racial trauma can be exacerbated when those around you kind of invalidate your experiences or tell you that what you experienced isn't racism. They tell you you're being too sensitive. So that makes it worse, right? Because you have someone telling you that you didn't experience what you know you actually experienced. So now you're holding on to all of this on the inside, and you feel like you can't share it with people. And of course, that kind of racial trauma just held inside can break you down from the inside. Okay. But here's the kind of the maddening thing is that racial trauma, right? Trauma in and of itself can lead to a sensitization as well. So whenever people go through a trauma, they are sensitized. They're sensitized to the threat of racism. They do develop a hyper awareness to the threat of racism. So now you're in this position where you start doubting yourself. Am I being too sensitive? Was this really racism? Or, maybe was it not? And so what we have is this exhausting experience that a Black person faces every day in the US, where we're using a lot of brain space trying to figure out whether we're being discriminated against or not. And whether or not people around us are really seeing us or whether they're just seeing our race. So over time, that racial trauma can actually physically wear you down. And the term for that is weathering. Weathering. You can actually start to suffer from physical illnesses because that chronic stress actually starts to break your body down, right? So what can we do to actually reduce racial anxiety? What can we do to reduce that anxiety about, am I discriminating? Am I being discriminated against? Because remember that the definition of racial anxiety indicates that both people essentially fear rejection, right? So let's say the interaction is a white and Black interaction. The white person fears that they're going to be perceived as racist, which feels like a moral failing to them. And then the Black person anticipates that they're being discriminated against. They both are fearing rejection from each other, and they often assume that the other person is not really all that interested in them. And so what ends up happening is in these interactions, the white person feels this burden to prove that they are good and that they're unprejudiced. Okay. And the Black person feels this burden to prove competence and equality. And I just want to say again, it's as I think about it, the white person is kind of proving that they're a good person. The Black person is trying to prove that they're equal, that they're equal and competent. It's a different burden. And one of those burdens, I'll let you guess which one. Which one of those burdens can really break a person down and make them traumatized. So what I find and what many others have observed is that, white Americans and people of other races as well sometimes try to maintain racial harmony by downplaying differences. Okay. So they're like, well, maybe if we don't talk about it, I'll feel less anxious about it, But downplaying differences then makes Black people and people of minority races kind of feel disrespected. It's like, well, these differences are actually important to me and you're downplaying them. It makes me feel disrespected. So racial harmony doesn't mean that we all speak the same, that we all dress the same, that we all have the same forms of self-expression. Racial harmony really involves respecting differences rather than concealing them. So don't try to overcorrect or overcompensate by calling the student up to the front of the class and pointing out all their differences. You don't have to make a big deal out of it, but you don't have to conceal it either. It's really just about being, and allowing the differences to exist and to respect them. You don't have to call them out or suppress them. Just be aware of how those differences make you feel and make a conscious effort to be respectful. Because one thing we also know is that differences can feel threatening, right? Especially if you're struggling with racial anxiety and you're not aware that that's what's going on, is that if you're worried about being perceived as racist and you're in an interaction where differences are very apparent, the person, you can see it, now you have to be more vigilant about your body language. You have to be more vigilant about what your responses are. It gives you a bit more work, right? You have to use more brain space to think about whether you're coming across as discriminating or whether you are discriminating against them. And so it can feel so much easier to just unconsciously pressure the other person to reduce their differences, to just conform, right? You feel so much more comfortable if they talk like you, or if they try to do things to their parents to look more like you, right? Those things kind of increase your comfort level because differences can increase anxiety because you think, okay, how should I respond to this, right? So you may not even realize ways that you're kind of, unconsciously rewarding people even for downplaying their differences. So even something as simple as, complimenting a person for how they speak because they're speaking more like you. That is kind of like the subtle message of, I feel more comfortable when you speak more like I do versus speaking with an accent or, speaking some other way. When you downplay differences, it makes the other person feel comfortable. And remember, guys, we've been code switching for years because we've known this for a long time. It's been, kind of necessary for our own survival. But I think being aware of that racial anxiety can help you to be more aware of those implicit messages that you give to Black people and people of other races, that their differences are not welcome, right? So that's one thing that you can do to reduce racial anxiety, is to be aware of that. So the other thing that you could do to reduce racial anxiety is to increase the number of positive interracial contacts that you have. Widen your circle. Okay. And so this is not just like seeing positive role models on TV, because I mean, that's part of it. I think try to watch content, watch movies and TV shows that show different racial groups in a positive light, kind of the anti-stereotype. Try to watch people in roles where they don't fit the typical stereotype. That's helpful. But this is about kind of having more diversity in your circle. I mean, they don't all have to be your best friend, but try to have more contact with people that are different from you. Because you think about the example I gave earlier about like the one person who when they were 7 or 8 years old, their bike was stolen by somebody Hispanic. And so now they kind of are mistrustful of Hispanic people. The antidote to that is actually to increase your contact with people that are Hispanic, so that you have, 200 other examples of people that are actually trustworthy to negate the one bad experience you had. So now you have to do that with multiple racial groups as well. And it's something that I did actually for over the last, 20 years or so, just widen my circle, and when you talk to people that are from other places, I just want to say, you don't necessarily, the conversation doesn't have to be about race. The conversation doesn't have to be about culture. You don't have to interrogate them and pepper them with like, where are you from and where's your family? And you don't have to ask people necessarily all the questions about culture. Just spend time with them. Talk about general topics. Just increase your contact, because what it does is it helps to kind of rewrite or at least to form new associations, I should say. Helps to form some new associations, because you can't undo the associations you made when you're younger, but you can add new associations. So also I would just say, if you have like just a handful of people that are from other backgrounds, don't overwhelm them with requests and pressure them to be the ones to teach you about their race because they're not representative of their entire race. Don't always, invite them to things where like they're the only Black person there and they don't know anybody there because somehow it makes you feel less racist to have invited one Black person. Don't put people in situations like that. It's just about widening your circle overall versus kind of putting a lot of pressure on like the handful of Black people that you know. So reflect on things you have in common, respect differences, and widen your circle. If you're just joining, you're listening to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Kerryann Williams. I'm a psychiatrist here in Massachusetts. And today I'm talking about racial anxiety. What is racial anxiety? What can you do about it? If you want to call in, the phone number here is 617-238-7111. That's 617-238-7111. This is also streaming live on Facebook on the Facebook page heat981fm.com. So you can go to that live stream and you can drop a comment or ask a question if you would like. So the other thing that you can do to help to reduce racial anxiety is to be a part of the solution, right? So you can be a part of like promoting positive images of other races. Think about what you say about other races. Think about what you circulate on the internet about other races. Think about pictures that you use even in your PowerPoint presentations. For such a long, one classic example of something that has been changing over many, many years is there's always like this classic example of what does a physician look like? And a lot of times whenever people wanted to do any kind of marketing about what a physician looked like, they would always choose an older white male with gray hair, glasses, and a white coat. And as long as you posted that picture, you didn't really have to say anything else. People would just automatically assume, oh, that's a doctor, right? He's got a white coat, glasses, gray hair, and it's an older white man. And, on TV, they've, of course, been working for a long time to kind of rewrite that image of like, what does a physician look like? But that's one example of how you can help to negate a stereotype by presenting other images or representation. So you can do that on a personal level as well in terms of what you post, what you circulate, what you share, and what you say. So as I said earlier, you can't necessarily unlearn old stereotypes, but you can learn new associations and new views about racial groups. And that will help you to be able to overcome some of the things that you would otherwise say or do that might kind of basically to stop the automatic thoughts, just kind of try to change your behaviors. The other thing to think about in dealing with racial anxiety is if you have big decisions to make, like hiring or firing people, try not to do them when you're pressed for time or when you're stressed out, because that's when our brains rely the most on automatic mode. That's when they're most susceptible to unconscious bias. When our brains are stressed, our brain likes to take shortcuts, right? Just kind of makes a quick assumption and just like moves on because it's efficient. If you're stressed out, you don't have a lot of like time and energy to work on something, your brain is going to default to like making some of those decisions automatically based on instinct. And that's where unconscious bias can kind of creep in and influence those decisions. So maybe try to include other people in the decision, which might help to diffuse your own personal bias. But it's also helpful to have very clear criteria for hiring and firing to reduce how much of it is subjective. So if you have clear criteria for hiring and firing, that can help you to make decisions based on, company criteria. Reducing reliance on feelings. And this is not just for racial bias, that can help with other kinds of bias too, like sexism. Again, thinking, oh, the best person for this job is a female or a male or that sort of thing. Now, I should say there is a whole other side to this, which is a whole other discussion, which is where companies can actually have policies in place that tend to affect people of certain racial groups more than others, right? Making them more likely to be fired or less likely to be hired. And that's institutional racism. That's when unconscious bias affects policy making. And that's a whole different discussion. If you're not aware that you're creating policies that are kind of based on race-based standards and expectations, where your expectation is kind of based on dominant group kind of mindset or lifestyle, then you might think you're just making objective company standards. And that's why it's sometimes helpful to have a diversity advisor that helps you to review some of your company policies. So the other thing for reducing racial anxiety, that anxiety about interracial differences, is pay attention to activism. Now, I deliberately didn't say that you have to go out and be an activist, not necessarily. But if you see people out there protesting in the streets, instead of just invalidating them, try to understand their side of things, try to understand their experiences, and recognize that if you are a part of a dominant group, right, you may be blind to what another group experiences on a day-to-day basis. And particularly if you lack exposure to a particular racial group, you may be blind to what the larger group experiences. And is sometimes I think a feeling that just having a handful of diverse friends, that's enough. That's still such a small number of people to be exposed to. They're not representative of their entire race. Okay. So then remember when I spoke about stereotype threat? Stereotype threat is where, a person belonging to a race where there's this negative stereotype, that's kind of internalized bias gets activated. So the girl in the all boys class begins to underperform because she internalizes the idea that girls are not as good as boys at science and engineering and math. One of the ways to deal with stereotype threat is to address the person's sense of belonging, to address their sense of belonging. So according to this guy named Bill Kennedy, he wrote this whole thing about debiasing techniques. And he says, when people worry that they don't belong or aren't valued because of their race, they're likely to interpret experiences in a new environment as evidence that their race is an impediment to their belonging and success. So when they encounter new experiences, they're more likely to attribute some of that to being race-based. So they did this intervention called the social belonging intervention. And it was in the context of education, and it was based on a survey result that showed that upper year students of all races felt out of place when they began, but that the feeling abated over time. Okay. So what they did was they had both black and white students that were told this information. Both black and white students were told that upper year students of all races felt out of place when they began, but the feeling abated over time. And they were also given a series of reflection exercises as well. And when they were told this information, it resulted in an improvement in the grades of the black students because they were less likely to attribute their new experiences to being race-based and to feel like, oh, this might be kind of something that all students go through. As predictably, it had no effect on the grades of the white students. The white students don't have a problem feeling like they belong in a white space, right? So basically, the intervention protected the students of color from kind of assuming that they did not belong on campus when they encountered social adversity. They didn't necessarily think it was a race-based thing, and that helps them to be more resilient in these situations. So it helps if you interpret that your initial sense of not belonging is a feeling that will pass, and it's a feeling that all people have, rather than evidence that you don't belong. And, in a job situation, this could look like, telling new employees in an orientation, something like that, that initially you're going to feel out of place, but it's going to be okay. Or just other statements that help them to feel on par with one another, to reduce that feeling of the stereotype threat that can cause underperformance. Now, this guy, Bill Kennedy, also advised having a growth mindset. And it's based on this work by someone named Carol Dweck that basically says abilities can be thought of in two ways, right? There's thinking of it as just kind of an entity where either you have it or you don't have it, right? Or you can think of it as, well, I don't have it now, but I can learn it. So those are two different mindsets. If a person holds the mindset that you either have it or you don't have it, then when they perform poorly, they're more likely to interpret it as, I guess I just don't have it, right? But if you have a growth mindset, when you perform poorly, you'll think, oh, I guess I just don't have it yet. I can learn this. I just need to work harder, which again can help people to be more resilient, and to reduces that feeling of that sense of underperforming, reduces that risk of underperforming. So then when you perform poorly, you don't think of it as confirmation of the negative stereotype. So performances at work would be the application, is that when you're evaluating folks at work, it's not a sense of, well, you either have it or you don't, but rather that you can achieve this. So there was this issue that I spoke about earlier about that racial anxiety can lead to advisors being fearful to provide necessary criticism to students of color, right? They don't want to be perceived as racist. They don't want to be perceived as, telling a Black student that, they can't achieve something. So sometimes they don't give them the negative feedback that would actually be helpful for them to improve and grow and perform more optimally, right? So this guy, Bill Kennedy, says he recommends something called wise criticism. Wise criticism. He says a significant challenge for people of color in school or work settings is determining whether negative feedback is a result of bias. So again, it's like you're wondering, when I get negative feedback, is it because I'm Black, or is it actually true negative feedback? It's hard to be sure. Or when they get positive feedback, they're not sure whether it is that somebody's just kind of placating them. They're trying to say nice things to them. They're overcorrecting. They don't know if it's a real positive feedback or whether they're just overcorrecting and trying to be nice. And that can actually hinder improvement of people of color, because now they don't know how to interpret the feedback. They don't know what to do with the feedback. So what they developed with this intervention called wise criticism that had two parts to it. One is to communicate the high expectations, right? So you're not downplaying the expectations, you're communicating the high expectations. But the second is you're also communicating a confidence that the person is capable of meeting those expectations. So you're communicating the high expectations, but also expressing your confidence that the person is capable of meeting them. That is incredible. I would say that even in my own life, I've had advisors that did that, and it was incredibly helpful that they expressed that second part, that they expressed a confidence in my abilities to meet the high expectations. I think that helped me kind of abated that stereotype threat in my own life. It helps me to not underperform as well, because I felt like they believed in me, and I should believe in myself as well. So communicate both the high expectation and the confidence that the individual is capable of meeting those expectations. So let's talk a little bit more about reducing bias. We talked a little bit about unconscious bias and racial stereotypes, but I wanted to mention a few other types of bias. There's an article on this website called Effectiviology, and there are a few other examples of bias. I just thought it was interesting. There's, this thing that they call the halo effect. The halo effect causes our impression of a person in one domain to influence our impression of them in other domains. So an example of the halo effect, and it's very aptly named because you kind of just see, oh, if they're good in one domain, they're good in others. So for example, if somebody is physically attractive, we assume that they also have an interesting personality, or that they're also intelligent, right? We just assume that because they have this one strength, that they're also strong in other areas. That's the halo effect. And there's also this thing called the ostrich effect, And this is where people avoid information that they think might be unpleasant. So for example, you may avoid going to the doctor because you fear that they may have bad news, right? And basically bury your head in the sand. So that's why they call it the ostrich effect. And then you may also be familiar with the pessimism bias. And that is, it kind of makes us overestimate that bad things are going to happen. So even though you're prepared for an exam, you might still assume that you're going to fail the exam. So you just feel very pessimistic about it. Negative biases can then contribute to anxiety, because then you're expecting the worst. And it can also contribute to depression, because if you feel like you can't do anything about it, then you kind of get depressed about it. And so that is another good reason why it's really important for us to identify and to reduce our biases, particularly racial biases, because it can contribute to depression and anxiety. And the biases that we have about ourselves can literally hold us back. And the biases that we have about other people can lead us to hurt them and sometimes hold them back as well. So the first part, of course, is to know your own personal biases, because if you can identify them, then you have more power. And you need to decide what you want to do to reduce that bias and figure out the situations where the bias is more likely to occur, plan what you're going to do, and do it. And sometimes just awareness of the bias can reduce it. So for example, there's this bias called the illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency, and that is a perception that your thoughts and emotions are more apparent to other people than they really are. And so this can affect people doing public speaking who may assume that the audience can tell how they're feeling. And so they did this intervention where they did a small study where they told speakers about what the illusion of transparency was. They told them that, hey, there's this illusion that people feel like others can tell what they're thinking and feeling. And just by the speakers being aware of the fact that the illusion of transparency existed, they're relatively more composed and less anxious when they gave their talk, because they were able to kind of reflect on, oh, maybe people can't really tell that I'm as nervous as I actually am. And then it may not surprise you that increasing accountability can also reduce racial anxiety, right? So think about the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter protests. Increasing accountability kind of makes people more likely to reflect on themselves. It puts pressure on other people to take accountability for their role in perpetuating racism. So, what are your thoughts on racial anxiety and unconscious bias? Have you found that you've experienced that racial anxiety in some of your interactions with people from different backgrounds, where you feel nervous about not wanting to offend them, or you feel nervous that you're going to be discriminated against? And, you can let me know about it. I'm happy to discuss about it. Thanks for joining me today for Black Mental Health Matters. I really enjoy talking with you guys every week. You can follow me throughout the week on Instagram and Facebook at drkerryann. That's DRKERRYANN. I'm also on Twitter and on YouTube. On Twitter, I'm drkerry_ann. Don't forget to tune in every week to Black Mental Health Matters. It's every Sunday at 1 p.m. on 98.1 FM, the Urban Heat in Boston. So thank you so much and have a great week.